Introduced at the end of 2017 with the iPhone X, so many people were convinced that that true depth camera system had to be miniaturized soon, right? I remember in 2018 we were all expecting smaller notch or no notch. Same thing again in 2019. Okay, yeah, they're definitely gonna shrink the notch this year. They have to, right? Then came 2020 and we were like, okay, with that 12 mini and the smaller screen size, this has to be the year they shrink the notch, right? Once again, shocking nobody, in 2021, there's rumors that the notch is shrinking, and we're seeing quite a few dummy units actually to back this one up, although I'm still not entirely convinced. But in today's video, I thought we'd discuss what Apple's game plan is with the notch and how it could instantly make a lot of their old devices look dated very quickly. Let's begin. I should disclose my opinion from the beginning. I really, from the bottom of my heart, do not care. The notch just kind of blurs into the background for me, and I've been using an iPhone 12 mini for the past 8-9 months now, and I'm perfectly fine with the notch being there for several reasons. For one, it serves a functional purpose with Face ID, which I appreciate greatly, and ever since I've been able to unlock my phone with a mask on, as long as I have my Apple Watch, and I'm comfortable unlocking banking apps and accessing passwords through Face ID and everything, I don't need Touch ID to come back. That's not going to be an incentive for me to upgrade. And I've also used phones in the past with smaller notches or no notch at all, and I've discovered that it does not make a huge impact on day-to-day use. Functionally, it really serves very little benefits to shrinking the notch other than cramming a few more widgets up there, but as someone who likes minimalism and loves the software to be clean and tight, especially with a display as small as a smartphone, I'm okay with not having the carrier name in the top corner of my phone 24/7, and I feel like that's what we had before the notch existed, and because the notch is there, it kind of forces widgets to be minimal at the top, and I'm fine with that. And I would honestly be kind of bummed out if, okay, the notch goes away, but now we're gonna crowd up the top of your phone with more icons, because in my opinion that just looks more cluttered, and I'm not interested in going back to those days. But at the same time, I agree that's not a good reason to keep the notch around, which is why I think I've seen a lot of people argue that the notch helps with making the iPhone iconic. So many smartphones these days, particularly in the Android world, basically decide between, do you want the camera hole in the corner or do you want it in the center? And that's the extent of variety you have from the front of devices design. Every phone is just becoming, biggest display possible, taking the display right to the edge. And yeah, you've got a little camera hole cut out here or here, but that notch on the iPhone that's been around since 2017 has become very recognizable, very iconic, and you don't see it on many Androids, so that kind of helps single out, okay, that's an iPhone and that's not an iPhone. So because so many people have gotten comfortable with it, I find this kind of surprising too. Many have suggested that Apple should keep the notch the same size and they should not shrink it, simply because that would ruin the iconic look of the iPhone that so many people are comfortable with. Seeing an icon that says works with iPhone and having that little notch at the top makes it very easy to recognize, and you understand that when you're looking at a display with that type of cutout, it must be from Apple. I personally think that's a bad reason to keep it around as well, particularly because my favorite Apple product is the iPad Pro, and that does not have a notch, and they're able to just put a little home bar in a lot of the icons for it, and that's how you recognize, okay, it's an iPad. You could also just for icons show a rectangle with an Apple logo, and I think that speaks for itself. So just being iconic, in my opinion, is not a good enough reason to keep the notch in the same size that it is, because people said the same thing about the home button for the longest time. We had always had the home button since the original iPhone all the way up to the iPhone 7. It had always been there, and icons and branding had always kind of embraced, okay, circular home button at the bottom and then a rectangular display above that. But Apple changed it because they found something better, and I do think that eventually in time Apple will find ways to either combine sensors in the true depth camera system or rearrange the earpiece so that the notch can be smaller, or eventually displays that can go transparent will allow the notch to be erased almost entirely, but the technology's simply not ready yet. But the weird part about Apple shrinking down the notch to me means that they will finally have to address that the cutout is more immersive on this year's iPhones, if it ends up being true, and the iPhone 13 lineup has a slightly smaller notch, but again, based on the renders and rumors we've seen, not by a lot. Would Apple directly address that on stage, or would they just act like, oh no, this is just the new design? Personally, I could see it going either way, because on one hand, there's not going to be a ton of groundbreaking features this year to get people to upgrade, so shrinking the notch is a very obvious and noticeable way for us in the tech community to notice at the front face of a device, okay, this one's different, this one does not look like last year's because that notch definitely looks smaller than before. But that would now imply that all of the notches in previous generation iPhones are actually an intrusion, and for the longest time, Apple has done their best through marketing and through their unveilings and through their keynotes to say the True Depth camera system is just a great feature, it's a great perk of Face ID. It's never been looked at as a downside, it's never been looked at as a drawback, and Apple has never wanted to bring up the notch as a con, of course, because that's the best they can do in today's world. So if they finally started shrinking the notch, how they market that, and if they start saying that the display is more immersive and that the notch is less intrusive now, that is implying that the past, 3 or 4 years of iPhones have had a more obnoxious, intrusive notch. And that kind of goes against, in my opinion, a lot of what Apple was standing for, and they didn't want the notch to be looked at as an intrusion. They just wanted the display to be looked at as immersive and large. So large that it goes even past your cameras. It's kind of a glass is half full / half empty look at things. And if they do start shrinking the notch this year, that means, in my opinion, that they do have the eventual goal of eliminating it entirely once the technology allows them to do so, and I just don't think it's ready yet. But the reason I think Apple is okay with that taking a long time, in fact, they might wait until the end of this decade before they remove it entirely, is simply because there's very little you can do with the front face of a device once you've eliminated pretty much everything other than pixels. If Apple is finally able to get their hands on displays with high enough yields that can actually go transparent and not interfere with the biometrics or the performance of the front-facing camera, and now you've got a full-screen iPhone, no notch, like a lot of people have said, it starts to look very generic, and it starts to lose a lot of its character fairly quickly. And I've seen plenty of people in comments and on Twitter and on Discord say that the notchless iPhone look doesn't actually look that good. It kind of looks bland. It kind of looks like every other smartphone, and because of that, it kind of turns some people away. And I still think that Apple will eventually work on a way to eliminate it because they just want a clean, symmetrical design all the way through. Even when you're playing a game in landscape mode or watching a movie, they don't want you to have to think about that notch eventually, but in the meantime, they kind of have to put up with it. But similar to when Apple introduced True Tone, after you kind of get used to it and you go back to a device that does not have True Tone, it suddenly becomes way more noticeable and way more obvious, and I think something like that could happen with the notch. If this year it starts getting smaller, all of your older iPhones that have full-size notches, those will start to feel a lot more intrusive, and it'll make the iPhone feel a lot more dated, and then that exact same dilemma will happen again when the notch is gone entirely. And I don't think average consumers are going to care much. I could imagine a ton of everyday people looking at the iPhone 13 and not even noticing that the notch is smaller. I think that's much more of a tech community thing than we'd like to realize. But in the meantime, Apple's not going to have a ton of things for the tech community to get excited about aside from, yay, 120 hertz, or the A15 chip is even faster now to an insane rate that we can't even find use cases for this hardware. And that makes me think Apple does have a game plan to eliminate the notch entirely over time, but I do mean over time. They want to be intentionally very slow about this, and I think that's why if the notch does get smaller this year, it's going to be ever so slightly smaller. It's not going to be a night and day difference. It's probably not even going to be something a lot of people notice or appreciate because people don't look at that part of their phone. Like I've said before, there's all kinds of advertisements with, screen simulations on smartphones because that's what, commercial companies do. And I've seen all kinds of ads where there's notchless phones and people don't watch those ads and go, whoa, that iPhone doesn't have a notch on it. Unless, of course, you're the type of person to, watch Tailosive tech or you're in the tech community. Average people, they just see phone. They don't care about the notch, whether it's small or big, or it's a camera hole in the corner or whatever. But Apple admitting that the notch is intrusive and that they've fixed that problem is kind of admitting that they've had a design flaw on the past few years of iPhone. So that would be funny, and I'm very curious to see how Apple demonstrates that or advertises it at all. Knowing Apple, they probably just won't bring it up and hope that the tech community focuses on it, but average consumers don't even think about it. But I'm curious if you guys are going to be annoyed with the notch shrinking, or if you're happy to get any more icons up there as possible. I know all 3 million of you that always say, I just want the battery percentage to come back. They could have done that a long time ago. There's been jailbreak options that show exactly how you could show the percentage instead of the battery icon. Could have been done via software. They still haven't done it. So either way, let me know how you want the notch or camera holes to work out in the future. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.